So we're starting chapter 18, and it is going to be on England and America, the quest for freedom. We just finished with France and ended with a bloody revolution where France had actually sent away all the Christians, when sending the Christians, the so-called Christians that had the Bible. So France did not depend on the Bible. In fact, it went into enlightenment and atheism. So we're going to see a stark difference between France and England and America at this time. England and America, quest for freedom. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14:34. England's struggle for freedom. We're in the 17th century. And the 17th century was similar to France because they had a strong monarchy, a strong king, which threatened the hard-won liberties of the people so cherished. There was a limited representative government, and that was opposed by the king and even disbanded for a time. And many people suffered from economic hardships at this time. The one fundamental difference between England and France was that England had the influence of the Bible. You see this picture of the people of England at this time, the wealthy people down to the peasants. France and England. France rejected Christianity and embraced the Enlightenment in its place, reaping a bloody revolution. You can see here when the women, a lot of the wealthy nobles were what? Guillotined. It was very bloody. You see this woman here looking to her death. Many did, and many people that were innocent. And we learned that when we studied France. But in England, spiritual revivals in the 18th century strengthened the heritage of the people and made peaceful reforms possible. Likewise, in America, a spiritual awakening revived the colonists and prepared them for independence. So here we have the revivals going on in England and on into America, and we'll be talking about that later. King James. King James I, 1603 to 1625. That's when he ruled. He was the first Stuart monarch, Stuart kings, the line of Stuart kings. Well, remember Queen Elizabeth? Elizabeth was that queen that they loved, and she lived a long life. She was the last of the Tudors. Remember, her dad was Henry VIII, which, was a pretty drastic king in certain areas, especially beheading and dealing with his 6 wives. But anyway, Elizabeth died, and now the thing about Elizabeth never married and she never had children. So they had to find another king. So the king of James of Scotland united with England. They thought, if we can get this king of Scotland, which is a Stuart, remember Mary Stuart of Scotland? We talked about that before. Well, they thought if we could get Scotland to unite with England, that would be a good deal. So they brought in the divine right of kings. But anyway, that divine right went to the Stuarts and to King James. He felt like he had unlimited power now in both Scotland and England. He believed that kings were appointed by God, so they should have unlimited power. And it was in high contempt dispute what a king could do, which meant that he felt that no one should argue with him, that he just had complete rule. And this would bring England through this hardship and this constant dispute between the representatives of the parliament that were representing the people and this king. So King James, he wanted to have complete power like the King of France under Louis XIV, similar to that. King James conflicts with the courts of law. He believed divine right placed him above the common law and above the enactments of the parliament too. So James insisted that the English judges obey him without question. In fact, he fired them if they didn't agree with him. But the judges insisted that no man, not even the king, is above the law. Remember the common law with the Magna Carta way back when we were going, what came around comes around, goes around again. We're going through that same fight between the kings and the parliament. And then James replied to all this and says, well, the king makes judges. He felt like he could fire judges. So he didn't see that no man, not even the king, is above the law. He felt that he was above the law. King James in those pictures. Let me back up a little bit here so you can see the whole thing. Okay. James versus the Puritans. So James realized unless he controlled both the state and that he controlled the church, his rule would be limited. So he wanted to control the church. In the 1600s, English Protestants were dissatisfied with the Anglican Church, the English church at that time. The church maintained many Romanist practices and ideas. Many practices in the Roman Catholic Church were similar now in the Anglican, the English church. And so the Puritans wanted to actually purify the church. So the king, though, he wanted to be like the Pope was and control its own bishops. He didn't want to be really part of the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope. He wanted to have the power with his people, just as the Pope had power in the church. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of some of his those coming against James there in the Parliament. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. By 1580, the Puritan bishops totally rejected the Church of England. They would call it the Episcopalian Church at that time, or Anglican Church. They wanted what's called a Presbyterian form of government, in which presbyters or elders ruled through representatives. And so, not ruling, but they actually pastored the church that way. And the Presbyterians actually originated in Scotland, and they thought, Scotland, the king came from Scotland, but The separatists rejected both the Episcopal and the Presbyterian, preferring that each local church just be totally independent. So we have basically the Puritans wanting to purify the church and the separatists wanting to reject both the Episcopal and the Presbyterian and have independent churches. But the Puritans at this time were stronger than ever. They had representatives in the Parliament, in fact. Because King James was raised in Scotland with the Presbyterians, they hoped he would be sympathetic with him. But, of course, he viewed them as a threat of his power, and he did not want to deal with the Puritans at all. Persecution of the Puritans and separatists. Remember, the Puritans wanted to purify the church. The separatists wanted to be separate from the church. So the king subjected them to greater repression, vowing them to hurry them out of the land. I know that's their language back then, to hurry. He just said, I just want them gone. One group of separatists were the Pilgrims, who fled to America in 1620. Remember Thanksgiving? The Puritans were separatists. The rejected Puritans turned to the Parliament, and their cause began to look into. So when they turned to the Parliament thought, wow, we need to help these people. We represent the people and need to help the people. But James found it impossible for him to work with the Puritans in the Parliament and wanted them to be gone out of the Parliament. So we have a big conflict. Here's the Pilgrims here, and here's some of the separatists. These are when they're coming to America and having to leave England. The King James Bible. Okay, so I've had people come up to me and say, oh, what about King James? King James was this horrible king and did all these things, and he was not a very moral man at all, but he did agree on issuing a new translation of the Bible. In 1611, scholars completed the King James authorized version of the Bible, one of the best translations of the Bible going all the way back to the Greek scriptures. So King James was happy to put his name on the Bible, although he didn't live a moral life. What I think King James wanted is, remember, he wanted to be the head of the church. So when they came to him and said, oh, we want a translation, we need a new English translation, he probably thought, wow, yeah, then I could put my name on the Bible. So whenever you see the name King James, remember, I've had some people say, did you know that King James wasn't even a moral person and all this and stuff? Well, of course, but God still uses, he uses the foolish things of this world to confound the wise, so. But the King James is an amazing Bible, and King James is not worthy to have his name on it. England in the New World. So we're talking now about the New World is in the Americas, North and South America. Well, England. During the reign of King James, colonization began in the New World. In Virginia and New England, the territories had attempted to colonize. And colonize means to bring settlers in. They had explorers coming, but the explorers didn't settle. And so England wanted to bring settlers in, but they had failed in the 1500s. But then in the 1600s, in 1607, in Jamestown, Virginia, was the first permanent English settlement in the New World. I have to say that Jamestown almost, basically most of the people did die in Jamestown, and it was mainly men that came in to settle, but they did end up settling despite everything that happened and all. If you know Captain John Smith, and Pocahontas and all of that with Jamestown. We'll study that next year. But here we have a picture of Jamestown. In 1620, which was not too long after, the English separatists fled to England and established New England colony of Plymouth. That for the 1620, those were the Pilgrims that we know about in 1620. So Jamestown was first, and then on to the Pilgrims. And then the other colonies came with Maryland, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And this secured England's position in the New World. Now they're having settlers in the New World. So in that, they felt they could control the New World. King Charles. We have another king. King James dies. And Charles, his son, inherited the throne. And he too had a disdain for the Parliament. He did not like the Parliament. He didn't want to call the Parliament. And he had the same thoughts as his father. He ruled in 1625 to 1649. And we're going to find out about Charles here. He wanted not to call the Parliament and just do everything and rule as king. But wars with Spain and France were happening and made him depend upon the Parliament. Because Charles needed money. And for that, he needed a Parliament. When the Parliament denied his request, though, he went to the Parliament for money for the wars, and the Parliament denied his requests, then Charles forced citizens to give him loans. And if they didn't give him a loan, he would have put them in prison, or he'd draft them for the military. He said, if you're not going to give me a loan, you're going to have to fight, where I'm going to put you in the military. For anyone that refused him, he gave them harsh consequences. There's a picture. Kind of a young guy, huh? Troops were billeted. Billeted means they were lodged and fed by private citizens. So what Charles did was he basically said that private citizens that lived in the land were forced to lodge and feed Charles' troops without any compensation. They just had to feed them and lodge them and take care of them in their private homes for nothing. And the citizens who objected were tried in a military court-martial, and basically the practice was illegal under English law to do this. You couldn't try citizens for this cause. And then they were imprisoned without a trial, which meant if you did not lodge the troops and feed them, which, out of your own pocket, they could take you and put you in prison without a trial, or try you in a military court as a court-martial. And this, of course, was illegal. Remember, we go back to the Magna Carta, right? So it was illegal, but he did it. The English people were in an uproar about this, in fact, and the Parliament shared their sentiments. Of course, King Charles did not want to go to the Parliament and wanted the Parliament to be banned. But the time had come, the Parliament thought, for the king to respect these English liberties and say, well, the English people should not have to do this. So here's some pictures of how the soldiers came in to the families, and the families had to feed them and take care of them and give up their house for them. The Petition Right of 1628. This was a petition that the Parliament drew up because all of these things were going on. It said nothing new, but reaffirmed the liberties and rights what Englishmen had already won, that they already had dealt with this before. So this petition was just basically going back and to tell Charles that you cannot force citizens to do these things. But now, after this petition was written down, now this custom and tradition were embodied in the formal declaration written for all to read, which meant now they had a formal declaration that said the king cannot do this. So this was the petition that was put together against what the king was doing. England under tyranny. King Charles refused to honor the petition. Okay, what's going to happen now? In 1629, the king dissolved the Parliament. He said, I am not going to do anything. In fact, we're not going to have a Parliament. And he openly proclaimed to rule England without the Parliament or the people's consent, that he was going to rule, and thought he was just ordained by God to rule. Thus began the 11 years of tyranny of Charles I. For 11 years, he basically was a tyrant and was basically ruling England, similar to the kings of France. Now England was an absolute monarchy, well, like Spain and France. William Laud. You like that name? William Laud. Lived in 1573 to 1643. He doesn't look too nice, does he? Well, Charles tightened up his grip on the church too. So in 1633, he appointed William Laud as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which was basically running the church. But Charles was telling William Laud what to do. So William Laud determined to make the church more like the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and to strengthen the king's power and make him more like the Pope, right? So laws were set for the church attendance, and fines were given if you did not go to church. So if you did not attend church, then, and they knew that you didn't, they could go to your house and you'd have to pay a fine for not going to church. Think the people are going to agree with this? I don't think so. The Puritans, who did not like the Anglican Church, basically stood up against this, so they were persecuted severely. If you did not attend the church of state, you may suffer imprisonment, whipping, branding, and many other abuses, which they did to the Puritans. So many Puritans left England at this time. Many had already fled to America, but many more were trying to get out of England. So Massachusetts colony in America was established. The state of Massachusetts was established, the colony was established in 1630, mainly for Puritans that were coming to America. In 1642, 25,000 Puritans escaped to New England, most of them coming to Massachusetts. The religious war with Scotland, and so this is Charles's downfall, because he had William Laud now force the Church of England on Scotland. So he says, the Scottish people are going to have to go to the Anglican Church under Charles. Well, the Scottish church was mostly Presbyterian. They did not go to the Anglican church. So the Scots fiercely opposed the king's meddling and said, how dare he come and tell us what church we have to go to, and how dare they come and give us fines for going, because most of them never went to that church. So riots broke out, and then Charles had to back away because the Scottish, they were going to stand strong. So in 1638, the Scottish established the National Covenant, they called it, pledging to resist any attempt on their religious rights. They said, we have rights. We have rights. You cannot come in and tell us what religion we should be, or you cannot come and tell us that we need to go to the Anglican church. In fact, they disdained the Anglican church. So Charles responded by invading Scotland, of all things. Then the Scots rallied up to defend their freedoms and said, we need to all stand together, and they did. And they routed the English away. So in 1640, a Scottish army then invaded northern England. So now we have a war that shouldn't have been with England and Scotland. The Long Parliament. This is a really long parliament. You'll find out. Charles refused the defeat of England to the Scottish. So he said, basically, no, we're not defeated against the Scottish. As we said, the Scottish held their place and invaded. But he had no funds to raise the army. And basically, he had to call the Parliament back to session so he could get some taxes and money. The Parliament, though, was more concerned with English and Scottish liberties and freedoms than imposing the Anglican Church on Scotland. So they refused to grant taxes. The Parliament actually stood for Scotland. Can you imagine that? They did not feel that they wanted to invade Scotland to make them go to their church. But, Charles did. But the Parliament sat there for 13 years. That's a long Parliament. They fought against the king in the Parliament and trying to convince him to grant freedoms, the freedom of religion, the freedom for not only in dealing with Scotland, but in England too. The Parliament, remember the Parliament is representing the people. The Parliament was ignored by the king. So the Parliament put forth laws to limit the king's power, and the king wouldn't like that. And especially the power to persecute religious offenders. He said, basically, the Parliament says you can't persecute people that are not going to the church that you tell them to go to, right? So they also prevented the king from dissolving the assembly. He said, you can't just dissolve the Parliament. We're here. And this went on for 13 years with this long Parliament. The Grand Remonstrance. Anyway, that was in November 1641. This was a document stating additional grievances against the king in the Puritan religious reform. So as the Puritans were saying, we want to be able to have our religion on our own, and that we want to be free of the Anglican Church, they put forth this document. And Charles utterly refused the document. And basically, Charles personally, he even led several hundred armed men into the House of Commons to arrest the Puritans in the Parliament. He basically said, we need to get rid of these Puritans that are in the Parliament. And so he decided to go in, but the Puritans already knew what was happening, so they had already fled, so they weren't there. So the king was in an embarrassing yet serious situation. He was embarrassed. They had left, and here he was bringing, for the first time, he was bringing in his army into the House of Commons with a Parliament to basically fight the Parliament with an army. That is crazy. So we know that civil war was inevitable. What's going to happen? So there's going to be a division there between the Parliament and the Puritans in the Parliament and the king. So that's the first part. Now we're going to get in the second part in a little bit, but let's stop there.